I'm Mark Kantrowitz, alumnus of the first year of RSI in 1984. I started off as a math and computer science being my focus, but in part because of RSI, I had compiled a list of scholarships for math and science students, and that list grew over time until 1992. Prentice Hall approached us about doing a book about it. That book came out in '93. Right around when the web had started, and started getting questions asked about it by email rather than answer the same question again and again. I put up the answers on a web page, which became the FinAid website. And this was a principal spare time activity for me until in late 1999 I had to decide, do I continue my day job as a research scientist or focusing on the websites, and I decided I would do more good for society by helping people figure out how to pay for college, making it a more efficient process, than by building a better web search engine. Most of my former colleagues ended up at Google. I focused on the websites. And I just left FinAid and FAFSA 2 decades after I had founded FinAid to become Senior Vice President of Advisors, doing some of the same kind of work. But I think that this morning's talk, where they were talking about zigzagging, I tend to refer to that as walking sideways and seizing opportunities. I had not planned on becoming a financial aid and student loan guru. I was just trying to solve a problem, and when the opportunity came to do this on a full-time basis, I pretty much leapt to do it. And a lot of the things that I've done have helped people in a very significant way. The free application for federal student aid was put online on the web in 1996 because I implemented a prototype and handed it to the Department of Education and said, here, go implement it now. I've helped over 100 million students figure out how to pay for college. I've saved students several $billion in interest on their student loans. So I think that this, as kind of being the final frontier, to boldly go where no one has gone before, many problems involving people, especially public policy problems, have never been subjected to the rigor of scientific research methods or analytical tools. And some problems have never been explored at all. And this yields a lot of low-hanging fruit, where just a little bit of research can yield very powerful results that can influence policymakers. And now, most politicians are not mathematicians, they're not scientists. Only about 2% of the members of Congress have any kind of a science background. There are 5 members who are engineers, 6 are scientists, and 1 is a mathematician. So they don't really have a STEM background, and yet they're making significant decisions that affect STEM education, STEM research all the time. Now, one direction that you could head is, well, more STEM experts should go into politics so that we have a better management of the process, but another is that we can support the decision-making process by providing them with real evidence. Oftentimes, legislation is enacted by anecdote, not based on any kind of statistical evidence. They have one constituent complain about a topic, and they said, oh, there ought to be a law against that, and they go ahead and enact it without any thinking about the consequences of that action. And oftentimes, there's interaction between different pieces of legislation. For example, the early repayment status loophole that I discovered in the early 2000s, but didn't get the U.S. Department of Education to acknowledge validity until mid-2005, was a consequence of 2 separate disconnected pieces of legislation interacting in a way that allowed students to consolidate their federal loans while they were in school. This saved the students billions of dollars in interest because they were able to lock in the historically low interest rates of as low as 2.875% at that point in time, rather than seeing the interest rates go up. The next year they went up to 4.75%. And these kind of problems can have a big impact on society. They make a difference. They help millions of people. And they can have very far-reaching consequences in the future. Imagine one additional student being able to pursue a college education because of something you did. And it's also some of the most challenging types of research, and trying to influence people's behavior in a positive direction is extremely challenging. And over the years, and anecdotally, I found that people don't do computation in any kind of a rule of thumb that involves calculations like debt service to income ratio has absolutely no effect on their behavior. Comparing two numbers, however, is something that people can do, and it does influence their behavior. So there are lots of different opportunities for research, and what you're essentially doing is you're taking the intersection of two disparate fields, and it's an intersection that has not yet really been explored that much. The number of people in public policy relating to student aid, which is my field, is less than a dozen, and I'm the only one who's at all quantitative. The others come out of humanistic fields, and numbers are in many ways foreign to them. You can also identify and debunk myths. There are a lot of myths that guide research, like increases in student aid cause increases in college tuition, as though a $5,000 Pell Grant will cause a college to charge $50,000 tuition. Yet these myths persist, and by identifying them and then doing the data analysis to debunk them, you can have a significant impact on policymakers and whether they make changes that affect federal aid. Well, are they going to cut federal aid, or are they going to increase federal aid? If they think that it's causing tuition to increase and therefore has no effect, they may be more predisposed to cut tuition, to cut the student aid. Whereas if they think that it's making it possible for students to afford a college education despite the increase in the cost, they're more likely to fund increases in student aid. There's often a lot of bad assumptions behind public policy, and if you provide a clear analysis of the data, that can then highlight the problems and lead to solutions. You can also, as I did, identify loopholes in legislation that can save students money, make college more affordable. And oftentimes when you have a simplistic assumption, it can lead to unintended consequences, that can have disastrous effects on college affordability or college access by low-income students. So I'm going to give a few examples from my own work involving student aid policy. I've written well over 100 public policy papers relating to planning and paying for college, and many of them have been influenced or even enacted, like the Ensuring Continued Access to Student Loans Act was a piece of legislation enacted in 2008 to avoid a complete meltdown of the federal student loan system. And it was largely successful, whereas other industries that had contagion effects from the subprime mortgage credit crisis did indeed collapse. Now, there is, as an example of something that I did relating to total student loan debt outstanding, I had noticed that there was an interaction, this was back around 2003, between the federal funds rate and the interest rates on student loans. So I corresponded with the Federal Reserve saying, hey, you guys should take a look at this before making changes in the federal funds rate, because you will potentially have an impact on the cost of going to college, and that has cascading effects, not just on who goes to college, but after students go to college, the more they're paying on their student loans, the less money they have for other priorities such as household formation. And Chairman Greenspan, through one of his staff members, responded saying, student loans isn't a macroeconomic factor, we only focus on macroeconomic factors, so we're ignoring this. So at that point in time I said, well, it's going to eventually be a macroeconomic factor, I'll just start tracking it. And I had projected that it was going to become, total student loan debt outstanding was going to exceed credit card debt outstanding in the year 2020. And I was patient, but in 2008, I noticed that credit card debt had turned a corner and that it was going to cross sometime in 2010, and indeed in June 2010, the student loan debt outstanding exceeded credit card debt outstanding for the first time. Auto loan debt outstanding in 2011, and it hit the $1 trillion mark, a milestone. People pay attention to milestones in 2012, late 2011, early 2012, and federal student loan debt outstanding hit the $1 trillion mark earlier this year. And what this graph shows you below is the impact that my announcements had on the relative volume of articles for student loans in blue versus credit cards in red. And The first spike, big spike in the blue, was when I announced that student loan debt had exceeded credit card debt for the first time. That caused massive media attention, over 100 distinct articles written on that topic. The second blue spike was when it hit the $1 trillion mark. And the next two big spikes are actually in connection with legislative action concerning interest rates on student loans. The idea that student loan was now a macroeconomic factor made legislators start to pay attention to it and then to take action. This led to debate influencing the presidential election and most recently influencing the long-term interest rates. Not necessarily in the most positive direction, but still it had an impact. There's also this myth that everybody graduates from college with six-figure student loan debt. And this was caused by several newspapers and magazines doing features on, again, anecdotes of individual students who had six-figure debt. Business Week, the Chronicle of Higher Education, CNN, Huffington Post, Money Magazine, New York Times, NPR, San Francisco Chronicle, and the Wall Street Journal all ran stories about individual students with six-figure student loan debt graduating from college. In fact, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times did 3 separate stories about 3 separate students each. So this was, I mean, its shock value gets newspaper coverage, but it also influences people's decisions about where and whether to go to college. And some low-income students say, well, I can't afford six-figure debt, I'm not going to college. The reality, when I analyzed the data, is that 0.2% of bachelor degree recipients graduate with student loan debt in the 6 figures. It's very hard for them to do that. In fact, 90% of students with six-figure debt are graduate and professional school students, most prominently law school students, 36%, and medical school students, about half of them, graduate with six-figure student loan debt. And to a large extent, it's a matter of choice, not necessity, because more than half of undergraduate students who graduate with six-figure debt attended the most expensive colleges and the least generous in terms of financial aid. And it also was kind of interesting, and lots of factoids emerged, like students who major in theology, architecture, and history are much more likely to graduate with six-figure student loan debt than students who graduate with degrees in computer science, mathematics, and healthcare. So those who are least capable of repaying the student loan debt seem to be the most likely to take on this excessive debt. They're chasing a dream, they go to the most expensive college in their field, which is also among the least generous, and they end up being completely underwater. Now, the milestones may be impressive and they catch news media attention, they catch the attention of policymakers and college financial aid administrators, as well as university presidents. But the more important impact is, what is the impact on the individual students? And I'm just going to make one comment about this graph and then move on, since we have a limited amount of time. But you see that in 1992-93, the average student loan debt for a bachelor's degree recipient at graduation was a little bit less than a third of their starting salary. In 2007-08, the most recent data that are available, it was 48%. I will soon have 2011-12 data. But you can see a trend that the debt is catching up with income, and so this affects the affordability of the debt after the student graduates. They have to devote more of their income to paying for college after the fact, or they have to stretch out the term of their loan to reduce the monthly payment, which means that they'll still be in debt when their children go to college, which has cascading effects on the next generation. Now, given that, I wanted to know what extent students are graduating with excessive debt. And there are many possible definitions. One is that your debt service to income ratio is above 10%. I have graphs that show that the higher the debt service to income ratio, the greater the default rate on the student loans. And in fact, it seems to fall off a cliff at about 15%. Another measure is when the debt exceeds the annual starting salary, which was the previous graph was indicating. But they all show the same trend, where we go from about 2% graduating with excessive debt in 92-93 to 12% today. The next graph is probably going to show an even greater percentage. Now, for us to be in a bubble, we'd have to have about a third of students graduating with excessive debt. So all this talk about us being in a student loan bubble is hogwash, and it's people basically drawing superficial analogies with the subprime mortgage credit crisis, even though the student loan debt is going to derail the economy. It's a tenth the size of the mortgage market. Now, this hones in on an aspect. The more you focus on these things, you start developing ideas on how to measure the stress of the debt, or in this case, net price to total income. Net price is what you get from when you subtract the grants, the money that doesn't need to be repaid, from the total cost of attendance. And it is a strong predictor of debt at graduation. But it's also, even before students arrive on campus, it has an impact on their college-going behavior. And total income is taxable plus untaxable income. So this is showing the cost of the family relative to their, the share of their family income that must be devoted to paying for college, and it's an indicator of a stress on the family. And I divide them into 3 income groups: under 50,000, low income, middle income, and upper income. And what we see is, I mean, everybody struggles to pay for college education, but the poor struggle more than the middle income families, who struggle more than the high income families. But what's particularly telling is that a low income student at a community college will pay a greater share of their family income than a middle income student at a 4-year nonprofit college. And this is taking all grants, scholarships, and other gift aid into account. And this is what's caused a shift in enrollment patterns by the low-income students from bachelor degree programs to associate's degrees and even certificates. This graph shows you, based on the bottom, the x-axis shows income from 0 to 200,000 or above. And what you see is a green line in bachelor degree recipients. The lower the income of the family, the less likely they are to pursue a bachelor's degree. And this is despite being college capable. The more likely they are to pursue an associate's degree or certificate, and in the other direction, the opposite of mutatis mutandis. And so what this is responsible for is a decline in bachelor degree attainment among low and moderate income students. We're not taking advantage of our resource, our best resource, which is our people. We're not adequately investing in grants to help students pay for college. The grants are not keeping pace with increases in college costs, and low and moderate income students are increasingly being priced out of a college education. Now, another area of research, there's something called the 90-10 rule, which has led to all sorts of unintended consequences. And I recently put out a paper on it. What the 90-10 rule says is that if you're a for-profit college, and there's a lot of ideology that profit and education shouldn't mix, you're required to get at least 10% of your revenues from sources other than federal student aid. And the idea behind this is that there should be skin in the game, that the quality of the education should be good enough that the students are willing to pay for it out of their own pocket, or someone else is willing to pay for it out of their own pocket. But most often it's the student who's paying for it. And so this is using a financial proxy for the quality of education as opposed to direct measurement of the quality of the education, which is something I've been pushing for. And the unintended consequence is that while the 90-10 rule measures ability to pay, it doesn't measure willingness to pay. And so it's an ineffective proxy for direct measurement of educational quality. Whenever federal student aid increases, the for-profit colleges have to increase their tuition to force the students to get money from some source other than federal student aid, because otherwise more of their revenues will come from federal student aid. It provides them with a disincentive to enroll low-income students. A college that enrolls more than about 2/3 low-income students is going to be at very high risk of violating the rule. And other at-risk students, they are incapable of contributing to the education. They don't have the resilience of middle and upper income students who can go to an aunt, uncle, grandparent to get a little bit more money to pay for school. They don't have secret bank accounts that they can tap into. Another reflection of the tuition aspect is that if a college charges less than $8,000 in tuition, they are much, much more likely to violate the rule than a college that charges more than $8,000, because $8,000 is where the Pell Grant plus typical freshman year borrowing equals. So above that, they're kind of forced to get money from some other source besides the federal student loans and the federal Pell Grant. And an interesting fact is this rule only applies to the for-profit colleges. I did the analysis that if this were to apply to public colleges, 80% of community colleges and most four-year public colleges would fail this rule. So this is a rule that's being applied just to the for-profits, in a way that's not necessarily entirely fair. Now, another example of unintended consequences is there's been a big focus on college completion. The Pell Grant is focused on college access, enabling low-income students to pursue a college education despite the cost. The Gates Foundation and Lumen Foundation, which are the two largest education foundations in the United States, as well as President Obama, have proposed shifting the focus of the Pell Grant program from access to completion, to graduation, saying we're still going to give it to low-income students, but let's put it in service of increasing graduation rates. Now that may seem plausible. I mean, having a minimum graduation rate would perhaps increase the overall graduation rate. But the number of college graduates would actually decrease under a model that I created based on real data. For example, a 20% minimum graduation rate would shift $5 billion from community colleges to the most elite institutions who have graduation rates over 90%. Well, the problem with that is that when your graduation rate is over 90%, you have no room for improvement, whereas a college that has a 20% graduation rate has a lot of room for improvement. And my model suggested that the graduation rate would increase by 8.5%, but the number of graduates would decrease by 1%. And the reason for this is what you're doing is you're taking the most at-risk students and you're eliminating them, you're reducing the access. And one of the easiest ways to improve graduation rates is to become more selective. Don't admit students who are predicted to not graduate or to require more money to graduate. So if you focus only on students who have an A high school GPA, they are twice as likely to graduate from college than students who have a B high school GPA. If you look at people who have the highest admission test scores, SAT, ACT, versus the lowest, it's again a factor or two difference. If we look at independent students, the bachelor degree attainment rates are less than half those for dependent students. Or another example I like to give is students who are themselves single parents. So they're students, a mother has a son or daughter, and they don't have a spouse to help them out. They are very high risk of dropping out of college. Now, there are two approaches one could take to improving graduation rates. One is to deny these students admission. Your graduation rate will improve. It's not exactly the right solution. The other is to eliminate the barriers to their success. The reasons why these students don't succeed is if their babysitter is sick, they have to stay home from school, they miss class, they miss enough classes, they fail the test, they then drop out of school. Whereas if a college provides reliable child care facilities on campus, even just a list of drop-in emergency child care centers or reliable babysitting organizations that are low cost, it eliminates that problem. And the colleges that have adopted that solution have the students who are single parents graduating from college at the same rate as other students, instead of dropping out at 3 or 4 times the rate of other students. Another aspect of this is bachelor degree attainment rates for the Pell Grant recipients increase with family income. So someone who has a Pell Grant but has higher family income is more likely to graduate than someone with low family income. So within the Pell Grant recipients, you simply focus on the students who are getting a minimum Pell Grant, a $500 or $600 Pell Grant as opposed to a $5,000 Pell Grant. Your graduation rates improve, but you're cherry picking the best prospects. And you're not helping the poorest of the poor, even though talent is agnostic to the income of the student. So another way of showing this, if we look at the relationship between increasing the percentage of college costs that are met with grants and increasing the graduation rates, I've broken this down into 3 groups, again by income, low, middle, and high income. Among the low-income students, those who have less than a quarter of their costs met with college grants have a bachelor degree attainment rate of 45% in 6 years. Those who have more than 3/4 met with grants is 68%, a 23-point difference. Among middle income, it goes from 65 to 88, again, a 23-point difference. Among high-income students, it goes from 78 to 79, a 1 percentage point difference. And what the proposals that are being made by 2 very powerful foundations are effectively going to do is shift more money to the wealthy who don't really need it to succeed in college and where it won't make as much of a difference. Whereas the students who lose the money, those are the students who are harmed much greater, and so the harm to the students who lose the money far outweighs the benefits to the students who are more successful. And this is just one of a handful of the papers that I've done recently that has had an impact on the national debate on these issues. And it's basically, I mean, it's low-hanging fruit. The people aren't doing this kind of analysis. You pick your favorite field, you intersect it with public policy or some other field, and nobody's doing research in that area. You publish, and it's very easy to write a paper in that area that provides real, careful analysis, and it will have an impact on public debate. Now, generally speaking, I don't submit my papers to peer-reviewed journals because when I have 60 members of Congress reading everything I write, I don't really need to. I do serve on the editorial board of a peer-reviewed journal, so I can't submit it to that journal unless I recuse myself from reviewing my own papers. The peer-reviewed journals aren't really looking at it from a scientific point of view. And I have had a couple papers published, like causes of tuition inflation and trends in college affordability. But for the most part, I just put out the papers. I have my own personal peer review process where I have a colleague who I send everything to, and he reads it, critiques it, and I then make changes based on that. But I get a much faster time to print with these papers, and they have a much greater impact on society. And now, if there were more people doing this, then I might have to submit to peer review just to validate it. But I provide enough data in my papers to allow independent validation. And so far, nobody has challenged me on the accuracy of my work. They've mostly been trying to challenge it based on political reasons, saying, oh, you must be politically aligned with this group. And I've been able to address that by focusing on the data. The data drives the results in my paper. I form my opinions after analyzing the data, not before. There are a couple of people who write in this area who come in with an opinion, they seek out data that tries to support it, and they take it from there. So, thank you.
What are your thoughts on grants or loans that are based on jobs that are needed? I heard that Amazon, for some of their lowest employees, provides subsidies for education, but only for fields the Department of Labor says that we need. Have you looked into that at all? Or is that
well, I have no objection to financial aid being based on public policy goals. And public policy goals could be enabling students who have financial need to pursue a college education. It could be based on meeting national need areas, and there are existing grants like the Teach grant is to try to get people to teach in national need areas, urban areas that don't have enough science teachers, for example. So there is a lot of that. And also for merit-based aid, leading with your strength and trying to make college more accessible to the most talented of students. But what I object to is when so-called merit-based aid is not really being based on merit, it's more based on non-need factors, like is student a wealthy student, who's a normal full-paid student, can we get them to enroll by giving them $10,000 off a $50,000 year tuition? That doesn't serve any public policy objectives, it's a pecuniary interest of the institution. But I think looking at what the needs are is a good idea. The only problem is predicting where we're going to have a need 4 years from now is incredibly difficult. The BLS data shows that it's really not predictive even 3 years in the future. And so someone at the beginning of college education, it may not be as predictive. Now there are some efforts to take those employment needs, back them out through the degrees that are needed, and therefore what the high school preparation is needed, and at a very more approximate cut, figure out, okay, the high school curriculum should change in these ways to meet future needs, and since they're much more approximate, they're much more likely to be correct. And they're all saying things like, we need to have more science and math classes as part of the curriculum, we need to teach problem solving and financial literacy as part of the high school curriculum. And so that kind of stuff could actually have an impact. Unfortunately, there's an organization called the Jumpstart Coalition that tries to promote financial literacy in the high schools, They haven't gone very much mileage in getting it into the curriculum, so they're currently pursuing a teach-the-teacher approach where they teach teachers about financial literacy so that they can work it into their curriculum. Any other questions? Thank you.